Testament Code. This is the New Testament Code class. This is part 7. And we are just starting the second chapter, if that tells you anything about the first chapter and the preface. They're most difficult, but they lay the groundwork for everything else we do. And what we're finding here in the New Testament Code is an alternative Acts of the Apostles, primarily so far. An alternative Acts that I think perhaps after tonight we'll see that is maybe more reasonable and certainly more exciting, if there ever could be more excitement, than the canonical Acts of the Apostles. Am I being heard all right? Okay. In the Nazarene Acts, which I call the Clementine homilies, there are two, 5th century books written in Latin, or I should say translated from Aramaic to Latin. One is called the Recognitions, and one's called the Homilies. Together they're called the Pseudo-Clementine or Clementia. The real name of them is the Epilogue of Clement on the Acts and Preaching of Peter. Now, I have restored this book and republished it as the Nazarene Acts because one of the, let's say, earlier people that brought this book to life and light and told us in his books that there is a lot of authentic material in the Recognitions and Homilies. That is Hugh Schoenfield, passed away in about 85. He called this the Nazarene Acts. We have the tendency now to want to call it the Ebionite Acts, but what it gives us from beginning to end in 10 books, 10 rather short books, not only the entire theology of especially the Apostle Peter, but also how the hierarchy worked in the New Testament assembly, and some of the incidents that happened in the New Testament assembly, especially regarding their constant quarreling with Simon Magus. Remember Simon Magus, the magician from Acts? Acts doesn't talk much about Simon Magus, except he got converted after trying to purchase the ability to give the Holy Spirit with money. However, that's not what the Clementines or history have to tell us about Simon Magus. It tells us that he was a rival to the Apostle Peter, followed the Apostle Peter just about everywhere he went, trying to challenge him because Simon Magus was the successor to another fellow named Dositheus, who was a successor to another fellow named John the Baptist. So we have John the Baptist's group leadership now, a generation or so later, being Simon Chamag, or Simon Magus, the magician. And we have the leader of the Ebionites, being James the Just, the brother of Yahshua, or Yaakov HaZadik. So Peter, or Kepha in my book, is leading the charge on the behalf of James, the head of the assembly, to meet up with Simon Magus and debate him on the subjects concerning theology, praxis, how to walk, what laws to keep, if any. And during the course of Peter's journey in the Nazarene Acts, or the homilies, or recognitions, from Jerusalem to Tripolis in Turkey, we find numerous opportunities for Simon and Peter to get together to have a debate. By this time, Simon Magus is telling his people that he is the great God, and that the God that we worship is a demigod, intermediary evil God that created the world and all its evil, and that God named Yahweh is evil, and that the God Simon worships worships is much higher, and a good God, a loving God that really doesn't take any account of the world below. He leaves it to the demiurge, or the middle God, who is called Yaldabaoth in Gnostic literature, or the demiurge, or the Ogdoad. Several different names for this evil God besides Yahweh. It's got lots of names. The idea behind Simon Magus's theology is basically that if you know the right things, if you do the right things, then you will obtain through angels, whom he calls aeons, the secret knowledge. Then when you, in your body, you die, or preferably are martyred, in this theology, they understand martyrdom as one second. Martyrdom is understood as redemption. So when we speak of people in these Gnostic Gospels, when they get redeemed, well, they have to die, and usually they're stoned or somebody kills them. And then with that secret knowledge, they start to ascend up to the higher God. Only the ones with secret knowledge are going to ascend up, and they're going to be investigated by archons, or evil angels, or Paul talks about archons in Galatians, but the word's translated as principalities, powers, evil in high places. These archons will come as that spirit rises with the secret knowledge and asks questions and challenge that one on the way up. And if he's got the right knowledge, if he has the right answers to questions, then that redeemed soul will go on up to what they call the pleroma, or what Christians have an idea of heaven. They'll go up there to be with the Most High God, and they will transverse the evil God, the Ogdoad, or Yahweh. So we can see that that kind of theology, again, which we call Gnostic, and I have a lot of Gnostic studies on my podcast site. I'm not in favor of that, believe me, but it is very prevalent yet today, and it was in this first century milieu too. And had not the orthodoxy of Christianity won out in the end, then our Christianity might look quite a bit different, and in some places it looks a lot different. Take a difference between the fundamentalist church and, say, the liberal church. Fundamentalist churches are what we call orthodox, though they're not, and the liberal churches are very liberal or Gnostic in their thinking and ideas. The fundamentalists think about what to do, what to do, what to do, while the liberals think about what to think, what to think, what to think, and are obtaining knowledge. And none of these, either one of these on either end of the spectrum, is the right thing to do. What we get in the Nazarene Acts is not just a history, but we get a full understanding of the theology of the beginnings of our faith as put forward by especially Peter and Clement of Rome and James the Just, rather than Paul and the Greek table waiters that are enumerated or listed in, I guess, Acts chapter 6 or 5, I think 6. Now, in these Nazarene Acts, before we get to the fights between Peter and the Gnostics, we have probably the most astonishing notice in all biblical literature. The first session here, we went over it, but we've got some new people, and I suspect we'll want to go over it again in some detail. And that is, in the recognitions or Nazarene Acts, there is a physical assault upon James as he has been teaching new proselytes what it means to be baptized. He's there teaching on the temple steps with the disciples sitting down below him. This is in the days after Yahshua is gone, and James is a successor to the movement. Then all of a sudden, somebody comes up to James to wreak havoc on the group. He's only known as the enemy. So we'll leave it at that just for a minute, and we'll go back to that account in a minute. There's no such account as an assault upon James in the Acts of the Apostles, or really anywhere else in Christian literature. We're going to find out that the assaulter against James is Paul, and that he has a gang of people beaters to come against these Ebionite Nazarenes like James. And the persecution is so bad that James is beaten on the temple steps by Paul and left for dead. He's thrown headlong down the steps. He breaks his legs. He's left for dead. That's in the story. I think maybe I will just read that story. You might not be familiar with it, since we have new people here. And I find this in the Nazarene Acts, or the Recognitions of Clement, starting at book 1, chapter 70. And when matters were at that point that they, that is disciples, new disciples, should come and be immersed, some one of our enemies, entering the Hekel, the temple, with a few men, began to cry out and say, "What mean you, O men of Israel? Why are you so easily hurried on? Why are you led headlong by most miserable men who are deceived by Shimon or Simon, a magician?" So what this enemy is saying is he's calling James, the just, the brother of Yahshua, by the name Simon, the magician. In other words, he is calling James a follower of Simon. Now, while he was speaking thus, and adding more to the same effect, and while Yaakov, the Mevaker, now this is what I'll call James, Yaakov, and Mevaker means the bishop or overseer, was refuting him, he began to excite the people and raise a tumult, so that the people might not be able to hear what was said. Therefore, he began to drive all into confusion with shouting, and to undo what had been arranged with much labor, and at the same time to reproach the Kohanim, the priests, and to enrage them with revilings and abuse, and like a madman to excite everyone to murder, saying, "What do you? Why do you hesitate, O sluggish and inert? Why do we not lay hands upon them and pull all these fellows to pieces?" And when he had said this, he first, seizing a strong brand from the altar, set the example of smiting. And others also, seeing him, were carried away with like readiness. Then ensued a tumult on either side of the beating and the beaten. Much blood is shed. There is a confused flight. Change page. And I lost a page. Of course, just when it was getting exciting, right? In the midst of which that enemy attacked Yaakov and threw him headlong from the top of the steps, and supposing him dead, he cared not to inflict further violence upon him. Chapter 71. But our Chavorim, that is our friends, lifted him up, for they were both more numerous and more powerful than the others, but from their fear of Yahweh, they rather suffered themselves to be killed by an inferior force than they would kill others. But when the evening came, the Kohanim shut up the Hekel, and we returned to the house of Yaakov. And we spent that night there in prayer. Then, before daylight, we went down to Jericho, to the number of 5,000 men. So we have, after this beating of James and the other disciples of James, there is an exodus out of Jerusalem. And they evidently had a redoubt, or a place to retreat to near Jericho. Then after 3 days, one of the brothers came to us from Gamaliel, whom we mentioned before, bringing to us secret tidings that that enemy had received a commission from Caiaphas, the Kohen Hagadol, that he should arrest all who believed in Yahshua and should go to Damascus or Damascus with his letters, and that there also, employing the help of the unbelievers, he should make havoc among the faithful, and that he was hastening to Damascus chiefly on this account, because he believed that Kepha, that is Peter, had fled thither. And about 30 days thereafter, he stopped on his way while passing through Jericho, going to Damascus, Jericho to Damascus. At that time we were absent, having gone out to the sepulchres of two brothers that were whitened of themselves every year, by which miracle the fury of many against us was restrained, because they saw that our brothers were held in remembrance before Yahweh. Now, I'll read just that far, and I need to tell you that the writing here is that of Clement, who's known in religious history as Clement of Rome. Clement became the cousin of an emperor dynasty, that of the Flavians, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, the first two of which are the ones that destroyed Israel and Jerusalem in 70 AD. But Clement, Flavius Clemens, was a cousin of theirs, who finally died in the reign of the last of these three emperors that were his cousins, that is Domitian, because he observed a foreign religion, or actually superstition. Yes, if you got questions, type them in if you can, or just interrupt me. All right? I get on a roll here. And when I get on a roll, I try to check these every once in a while, but go ahead and break in. I don't care. So you can see that this is an astonishing account. Nowhere else puts this down, probably because Paul, as really the leader and the founder, why didn't they call Paul by name? That is a very good question. Because the rest of the book, scholars say that Shimon or Simon Magus is a stand-in for Paul. It could well be because at the time that this thing circulated in Latin in the 5th century, the Nicene Council already been there. And if they found out who was circulating this book and Paul was denigrated in there, then they would surely have been killed or persecuted sorely. So that may be the very reason. But the enemy and the idea that he's going to Damascus with letters from Caiaphas. So what they're doing is identifying him without a name. They're identifying Saul. This is before he became Paul. And if you want to know how he became Paul, look in Acts 13. That'll tell you. There's one other account, though, that is very similar to this, and that is the attack of Paul on Stephen, which I'll talk to in just a minute. Well, it is said in the canonical Acts that Paul entirely approved of this murder of Stephen in Acts 1:8:1. And of course, when it talks about somebody carrying the coat of another, that means they're there in a leadership capacity while some other thugs do the dirty work. Paul in Acts 8:3 talks about the ravage of the Jerusalem assembly. And I should probably read that so we'll know it. Let's take a look at Acts 8. See if there's anything there. Oh, great. I got the Greek. Just what I need. I don't think you'd understand it if I read it off in Greek, would you? And there's Spanish. Where's the old Revised Standard Version? That day, a severe persecution began against the assembly in Jerusalem. And all except the apostles were scattered throughout the countryside of Judea and Samaria. This goes right along with what the Nazarene Acts has to say. There was an exodus out of Jerusalem. Devout men buried Stephen and made loud lamentation over him, but Saul was ravaging the assembly by entering house after house, dragging off both men and women. He committed them to prison. So we see this dispersion all throughout, and certainly to Jericho. And one interesting thing, I think, that right outside of Jericho, we have Qumran. And right outside of Qumran, we've got the wilderness camps in the land of Damascus. So our author here, Eiseman, of course, he is going to infer that the Nazarenes or Ebionites that we're talking about, that is, our founders of the faith, were Essenes. And it's very evident, especially when you read the canonical book of Acts, because everything in that book, except the fact that everybody in there is a Greek, there are no Hebrew names in there at all, is Essene. Acts is the most Essene book in all of Scripture. They live together, they live in community, they share property, they're peaceful. Even when the Hebrews and the Hellenists have disputes, those disputes are settled. Very much a scene. And of course, the speeches in Acts, the speeches of Peter we talked about last week, and here of Stephen, which we read last week, and some of the others, they are extremely Essene, using some of the same language and phraseology that is used in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, in Acts 8, we go down to verse 9, and we see this Simon being introduced. A certain man named Simon had previously practiced magic in the city and amazed the people of Samaria, saying that he was someone great. Well, it's well known that the successor to John the Baptist was from Samaria. All of them, from the least to the greatest, listened to him eagerly, saying, "This man is the power of God that is called great." In fact, Simon Magus, in the Nazarene Acts and other sources, calls himself El Elyon, or the great God, exactly as this tells us. He considered himself a god because of some of the things that he did before heads of countries, emperors and kings. He was known very well for his magic tricks, the ability to fly, the ability to build people out of air, and do all sorts of other things. In fact, found in Rome still stands, what do they call it? A stela. That is a monument to the great god, Simon. So he was well known in the empire at that time. In fact, there is a little book called the Acts of Peter and Paul that's very interesting, because in that book we have Peter and Paul facing down Simon Magus before Nero, the mad lead-poisoned emperor. And to see what happens in that book, like for instance, Simon Magus is going to top them all because he flies. Simon Magus is flying over Nero's head way up in the air, down on the ground. Paul is on his knees praying. And Paul says to Peter, "You rebuke that angel that's holding him up there and I'll pray." Peter rebukes the angel and down comes Simon, hits the ground and dies. And so Nero is so fascinated with Simon that he takes Paul and Peter and has them beheaded. So that's the story of the death of Peter and Paul. I have that on podcast out at JS Presents on my podcast site. It's very entertaining. And whether you believe it or not, that's another story. All right, back. Acts 9. We want to look at that briefly. Everybody knows what that's about, mostly. And we must remember, I am not giving my opinions here. I'm doing commentary on one of the hardest books ever written to read, and that is the New Testament Code by Robert Eiseman. But in reading that and his other book, James, the brother of Jesus, you can learn so much if you can keep with it. There's a lot there that will shock you. It took me probably 20 years to digest it, but now I've got it. And I'm able to talk about a lot of odd stuff because of that, and people don't like me, some because I talk about this. But in between the lines, there is so much that Brother Robert Eiseman has gotten and put in these books that it's almost irresistible. 9 in Acts. Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Master, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, think of that, men and women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. The way is what they call the movement. That is the Ebionite or Nazarene movement that we are now hopefully a part of. This is exactly the same word that's used in the Dead Sea Scrolls for those people as well. That's not surprising because they're the same people. The people we hail as the founders of our faith, they're the same people that were part of and wrote some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And some of those scrolls have to do with this very history. I'll talk about that maybe in a minute if we get there. And here's the story. Now, as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Master?" The reply came, "I am Yahshua, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you'll be told what you are to do." This sets up a whole bunch of circumstances. First off, Judea was at war with King Aretas, who was the king of Damascus. And the king of Damascus blamed the war on Herod, the king of Judea and Israel. Why? Well, that's that Herod Antipas we've heard so much about, because Herod dumped his wife for his brother's wife. Now, why would that make King Aretas mad enough to invade? Because his wife was King Aretas' daughter. Paul is a Herodian. We read about him being a member of the Herodian family in his own letters. And when he writes to special people, numerous of the people he writes to in Romans, Philippians, Corinthians are Herodians. And he tells us in his letter to greet my kinsman, Herodion, and his parent, Aristobulus. So he's telling us that his kinsman is Herodion, which means the littlest Herod. That would be Herod V, whose father was Aristobulus, another grandson of Herod the Great. And Paul does not mention Herodian's father or Aristobulus' wife. This is in Romans 16. There's a good reason he doesn't, because his wife's name was who was the girl that danced before Herod Antipas for the head of John the Baptist? Somebody tell me, I can't remember right now. Salome? Now, if you can tell me who played it in the movie entitled Salome, I'll give you a few golden emeralds. The mother of the littlest Herod Paul calls his kinsman in Romans 16, is Salome, who danced before Antipas, Paul's cousin, and got the head of John the Baptist. You find Paul in the genealogy of Herod as well, which is surprising enough, but you also hear about Paul as Saul being talked about in the histories of Josephus. Number of times that Paul causes riots, that he has a gang. Rita Hayworth. He has a gang, that a murderous gang. We'll get to that sometime when we get down to that part. Now, you might say that was before his conversion. Okay. I wouldn't say not. I wouldn't say not. I'm going to not doubt whether Paul was converted or not. I just wonder sometimes what Paul was converted to, because his theology is so much different than James and the rest. And, he and James are always going at it. They're going at it in Galatians. They're going at it in 1st and 2nd Corinthians and other places too. Paul was the first big AC. What's an AC? Oh, yes, Greek philosophers, 12 quotes from Greek philosophers, no quotes from Jews at all. Mainly Seneca, who was his friend. Paul wrote to Seneca. Those letters couldn't get in the Bible because Seneca was the guardian of the Emperor Nero. Paul was close in with the imperial court. He writes to Epaphroditus. Talks about Epaphroditus being left sick someplace in Philippians chapter 4. Well, Epaphroditus was Nero's secretary and secretary for the next 3 emperors, but he was also the murderer of Nero. Paul's got connections. Right there are 2 of the imperial party. So the debates on the temple steps that I talked about, they parallel the debates in Acts, those of Peter, John, and even Stephen, but no James in Acts. No James. In the recognition, John is put out of a role. He has no role, probably because John is up in Ephesus. John isn't hanging out in Jerusalem. He went up to Turkey or Anatolia. No John there. We have just Peter and James mainly in the Nazarene Acts, in the recognitions. In the debate, one is identified as the enemy, and he butts in just before the baptismal services, fomenting a riot, breathing and killing. This enemy beats James with an altar brand, casts him down headlong, interesting word, headlong, leaving him for dead, breaking at least one of his legs and probably 2, says Jerome, the Christian writer, early on. Imagine this account in the canon. They couldn't put that in there. In the recognitions, this headlong casting down of James parallels the Christian church historian Eusebius, his account of the poor end of Judas Iscariot as well. And Eusebius' account, of James being cast off the temple parapet and stoned. Yes, keep it up, Allison. Would you please? So we've got parallels with Judas Iscariot. Acts 1:18 speaks of Judas casting down as being a reward for unrighteousness in a field of blood. You must be ahead of me on that book. The enemy receiving a license to kill from the priest. And it's as good as a name for identifying this person, because you wouldn't have to identify him. Everybody would know him by this time, by the time this came out. And then James is taken to a house, or his house, All right? She can do that. She's the understudy here. She's got to help. And then there's an exodus to Jericho and then to Damascus. And I read Acts 9. Eiseman says, this is not Christianity. This is real Essenism. Then as Acts is the history from the inside, while Acts stories are somewhat refurbished and carefully redacted or edited. Remember, Acts didn't come out till after 90 AD. People like to give it an earlier date, but they really can't because Acts uses a document called Antiquities by Josephus, and we know when it came out. Acts uses it for some of its characters and some of its situations. History from the inside. I kind of like that idea. Identities and names and Acts, they're and in the Dead Sea Scrolls are either recombobulated names, like I mentioned time and time again, Judas, Theudas, Thaddeus, Adai, Adius, Lebbeus, all these names. What is Luke trying to do? Well, he's trying to keep from being arrested himself. That's one of the reasons he doesn't identify himself. As I said many times in those days, if you wrote about these criminals, you were assessed the same penalty as these criminals. So somebody that would write this Acts of the Apostles or one of the Gospels, they didn't dare tell what their name was. The names that we have on there are from the church that put them on there much later. If they put their names on, they would be hunted down, just like the disciples and the Essenes were. And yes, the Catholic Church put them all together. And what they threw together, they can change, and they have greatly in the years. Now, this kind of language as well, the identification by, epithets rather than names. That is another way the Dead Sea Scroll talks about people like the wicked priest, the lying spouter, the teacher of righteousness. Nobody's named hardly in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In Acts, on the other hand, the same language is used, but the names are combobulated every way they can be. James becomes Stephen. James becomes, in some effect, Judas as well. We don't know the story yet of James' death. That was told in an earlier session of this, but we see the same language of James' death in 62 AD that we find in the scrolls, especially language considering the terms like throwing down or casting headlong or causing to stumble. Important words. He could very well have been. He could well have been. Stumbling, because these are the same words used in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Habakkuk Pesher, if you want to know which one, in regards to the teacher of righteousness, the one who it said considered the poor, Hebrew, Ebionim, the Ebionites, the poor. These ones that the teacher considered were also the perfect of the way. We could compare Acts 9:22 to that. When the wicked priest appears at Yom Kippur, who is James in disguise. James is the righteous priest, and Ananus is the wicked priest in the Habakkuk Pesher. So we're talking about a certain book from the Dead Sea Scrolls that has everything to do with what we're talking about. That this wicked priest was swallowing these people, the poor, the simple doing Torah. He was swallowing them because the foreskin of his heart had not been circumcised, casting them down. According to the Habakkuk Pesher in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we've done plenty of work on in the past, he does this in a conspiracy with others, a conspiracy to destroy the poor, Ebionim, who are also defined as Torah doers. That's what the word Essene means, doers of the Torah, also called the simple of Judah doing Torah. We find these in both the Habakkuk Pesher and the Psalms Pesher in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's to these people that Habakkuk chapter 2:4 is referring to, according to the scrolls. That is, the righteous shall live by their faith. Excuse me. The simple that are spoken of in the scrolls are the same as those who refuse to eat the unclean or to call all men unclean, because they're not all unclean. Look at what our dispute is in Galatians. Two things: table fellowship with the unclean and circumcision. Remember, they're all sitting at the table. Some men come up from James, spy out. Paul says to spy out our liberty. Peter, Barnabas, and the others that were of James' denomination, they get up and leave. That's the end of Barnabas and Paul. That's the end of Peter and Paul. They don't hang with each other anymore because they consider that Paul had gone over to the other side. Indeed, when he comes back to Jerusalem for the last time, the rumor is all over the place that he has abandoned the Torah and teaching Gentiles to do the same. And what do they want to do? They want to kill him. He just barely escapes. I'm going to get a drink for just a minute. I've got a little bit of a cough here. I don't know if that's better or worse. The minute I drank it, I choked on it. Do you think that's the enemy? What did she say? Let me see. Well, I clicked on that chat. I'm going to go through this chat, and I'm going to be done in just a few minutes. All right. Before conversion or after? Let's save that. Don't let me get past it. That's why I was making it emphatic. Look, well, Paul's conversion on the Damascus Road. Okay, well, hold that one. We'll get to it. Those refusing to eat unclean or be around unclean people. This is the Essene way. We don't go hobnobbing with the world. We don't eat unclean. We don't eat with a bunch of sinners. We don't. Even now. We don't stretch out table fellowship to people we don't know. And neither did these guys, your forebears, because to do so, later on in the Nazarene Acts, book 4, it tells you clearly why not. Because what do the righteous have to do with sinners? And do you think that if you bring those devils into your house, they're not going to affect you? Let me tell you, the last 5 people I brought into my house made a huge difference in my life this last year. Because I didn't heed, or I thought I did, and I got some that were wolves in sheep's clothing. These same ones can be identified in the historical records of the first century as zealots or Essenes, again, Torah doers. You might remember in Acts chapter 21, I think, Paul makes his last trip down again, like I mentioned before, and the elders of James say to him, but look at all these ones here that are zealous for the Torah. The very word zealot is used, kana'ah in Hebrew. Now we have a heresiologist. Yes, timeline would be good. His name is Hippolytus. He lived until 235 AD. So he writes about 150. His intention, along with so many other Christian apologists, were to write up the different heresies of their day. And let me tell you, in their writings, like the Panarion of Epiphanius, in Hippolytus, in, what's the other guy? Origen, they name every denomination you can think of. There's only one thing that sets them apart as heresies, and that is they keep the Torah. Remember, these are people just on the cusp of Constantine and the Nicene Council, just on the cusp of that. And they're moving toward a time when they see that the Roman Catholic faith will be the faith of the world if they can overcome their enemies. Their enemies are all the different sects of Judaism and Christianity that follow Torah, because the idea at that time was you don't have to do any good works. To do good works or to keep the Torah is a sin, because you are not trusting the mercy of Christ or his passion. If you do any law, they never think about keeping the law because you love him or because you want to do what's right. It's only you run away from the law for the sake of the mercy of Christ, else you are testing Christ. So all these heresies, including the Nazarenes, where the heresiologists say, well, our master came out of the Nazarenes. But it's as though our master came to our way of thinking, because he must have commissioned Paul. Now, that's what Paul teaches. But they didn't know each other. I think that Paul might quote the master one time, like, better to give than to receive. I don't know of any more. But in the heresiologists, we have Ebionites, Elcassites, Nazarenes, daily bathers, Masbuthians, Samsonians, Sabaeans, Elcassites, I said them. Those who keep away from things sacrificed to idols and the pollution of idols. They say, well, today we don't have to worry about that. Nothing sacrificed to idols. Go into a Chinese restaurant and see if there's nothing sacrificed to idols. Or go into a Polynesian restaurant and see if they don't have their gods right up in the front with food there sacrificed to those idols. You don't eat that stuff. Again, in the Nazarene Acts, chapter 4, you find out why. I won't spill the beans. The Ebionites kept Torah. And as these heresiologists say, that the Nazarenes did everything like us, except they keep the Torah. That makes them heresy or a cult. But the Ebionites, who didn't take to the pollution of idols, who did not eat what was unclean, who kept Torah. These are the followers of James. Eiseman calls him par excellence, himself considered to be the bishop of bishops and the bishop of the poor. They call him in the ancient literature the crown. That is the Stephanos. So I say you can link James' death and Stephen's death up. They're just the same. Stephen means the crown. This is what they called James. They called him Stephanos because he wore the crown of the assembly, or the mitre, I should say. He's also called the obelius, or the pillar, or the bulwark. Almost done. James doesn't die here at the bottom of the steps. I mentioned one or two legs are broken, but in another 20 years, where the story of Stephen is conflagrated with the early accounts of James' martyrdom, James is carried to a house, probably his own house, probably in the Essene quarter, probably near the tomb of David. That is the cenacle. The upper room we talk about was second story of the tomb of David, and it's still there to this day, just like Peter says in Acts 2, the fallen tent of David, still here to this day. That's where he was when he was speaking about it. We have in the Christian literature, James' house. And then we have Peter's escape in Acts, where he goes to the house of the mother Mary of John Mark, another character we never heard for before or since. Some say he's Mark that wrote the Gospel of Mark, but nobody named Mark wrote that. Or they say John Mark is the one that went up with Barnabas. How do we know that? We don't. Nobody knows who he is. But probably what the conflagration again here is that the house is Mary, the mother of James' house, because these correspond on the timeline. I know I'm getting a little sketchy here, but I'll finish up with a grand hurrah. Even Hippolytus I was mentioning, the heresiologist tells us that these people were called zealots and sicarii. That is, those that kept a dagger. Remember when Yahshua says, the day will come when you'll need a sword, and Kepha says, here are 2 swords, master. And he says, it is enough. He doesn't say to go unarmed. They carried arms. There at the house is left a message. The message is written to James' brothers that he's leaving town. James is thus removed from that temple steps situation and from Jerusalem. We compare that with Acts 12:2. This is interesting. I guess I'll end up with this. Let me go to Acts 12. You'd think that the one that was the head of the entire worldwide assembly, the one that Yahshua designated himself by the laying on of hands in the Gospel of the Hebrews to take over the ministry, would have something to do in the book of Acts. Here's where James is taken out in Acts. Same place he's mentioned. Not until chapter 12, where it says, about that time King Herod laid violent hands upon some who belonged to the church. He had James, the brother of John, killed with a sword. James is taken out. You say, that's not the same James? Well, Eiseman would say that this other James, the brother of John, didn't even exist. He's just a placeholder here for James to be kicked out and then put back in later in the same chapter. We have James again. See if I can find that. James. All right, and that is about down in, let's see, chapter 12:12. As soon as he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark. And in the other book, we're talking about the house of Mary, the mother of James. What a parallel. Where many had gathered and were praying, when he knocked at the outer gate, that is Peter, a maid named Rhoda came to answer. On recognizing Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed that instead of opening the gate, she ran in and announced that Peter was standing at the gate. They said to her, "You're out of your mind." But she insisted that it was so, and they said, "It's his angel." Meantime, Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the gate, they saw him and were amazed. He motioned to them with his hand to be silent and described for them how the master had brought him out of the prison. And he added, "Tell this to James and to the believers." Then he left and went to another place. This is the introduction to the head of the whole assembly. You don't hear from him again until Acts 15, when the so-called Noahide laws are given to the Gentiles, of which there is really no such thing as a Noahide covenant. You can find that. Tell me, I'll believe it. I'll believe it. So back to where we were. As before, some 5,000 leave for the redoubt at the Jericho, their fallback point. Same number that Josephus says, taken right from Josephus, same number that were fed in one of the feedings, 5,000. Then Paul gets letters. The only letters he will receive. Till we get to 1 Corinthians, we'll find some more. He should have gotten the letters from James, says Eiseman, if he was going to be able to preach or teach in the name of Jesus. And that why? Because again, in the Nazarene Acts, nobody can preach in that name except they have documents from James that permits them. It's the same way with us. We're going to look at people very closely before we have them speaking in our meetings. Look at denominational Christianity. Yes, so many people have been denied opportunities to speak in, say, the Assembly of God. Talking to a guy yesterday that was. Why? Because they don't want something else taught in there. They don't want a hint of it. They want to keep whatever their doctrine is pure, whether it's right or wrong. They kept asking me years ago to come and sing in the Mormon church. I said to them time after time, I'd be happy to come sing in the Mormon church, but you have to let me testify too. Nope, can't do that, just sing. No testimony, no singing. Afraid of what you're going to say. So he goes forth to Damascus, and they go forth to Jericho. And we wonder if Jericho isn't a fill-in for Qumran. How close is Jericho to Qumran? Right next door. Or Damascus. Damascus, the land of Damascus that the Dead Sea Scroll speaks of all the time, remembering again that Damascus need not be a place, though they say this is where the wilderness camps were of the Essenes. But Damascus is talking about the bloody cup. Damashek in Hebrew means the bloody cup. Think about Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 and the communion services of the Didache and the four Gospels. The bloody cup, Damascus. It could well be a code word for that, and certainly in the Dead Sea Scrolls it is. It says, though, that Paul missed them, because outside of Jericho, as they were dragging James along with his broken legs, or maybe it was part of what, when they said that James prayed so much on his knees that he had knees like camels, maybe it was his broken legs, they came across the tombs of two brothers who had fallen asleep. They stayed there at the tombs of the two brothers who had fallen asleep. The thing about these tombs is that they whitened of themselves every year to remind the people that if they persecute the Ebionites, the Nazarenes, the Essenes, they're going to end up perhaps in the same tomb as these fellows. Now, one of the things that Robert Eiseman felt he had to do is to find some archaeological evidence for what happened in the Nazarene Acts, in the Clementine recognitions. And he took a group of students to Jericho one time, and they were wandering around, and one of his students pointed, saying, "There are the two sepulchres and the graveyard." And they got that on videotape. It's on YouTube someplace. And they begin to rejoice because here is the first time that any hard archaeological evidence mentioned in the Nazarene Acts had been found. Of course, mainstream consensus scholarship pays no attention to such things, unfortunately. The two tombs of two brothers who have fallen asleep. I asked Robert on the phone, who are those two brothers? Are they Izautes and Monobazus, the two sons of King Abgar and Helena? He says, no, we don't know who they are. That's who he said. I expected to have a little bit of extra there, but he didn't give it to me. So this is the kind of startling originality we find in the Nazarene Acts. An attack on James, James limping when he sends out Peter on his first missionary mission, or because he prayed on his knees so much. Yet until the discovery of the scrolls, certainly no one would have thought that 5,000 refugees would be hanging out in such a spare environment as Jericho, and especially the Jericho Cemetery. That concludes my presentation for tonight. Let me look and see what we have in the chat. That was hard. Somebody's eating dried apples and I didn't get any. When this incident was supposed to have happened? The gist of the Nazarene Acts concerning the conversion of Paul. I take no theological stand on any of this. I don't. I'm only the messenger. And that is that Paul never got converted. That Paul came in as an imposter and got a new idea. In fact, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are not concocted, these scrolls came out of the ground after 2,000 years. Nobody's messed with them. They called Paul the lying spouter, the spouter of lies, or the enemy, same thing. We find in Galatians and in James, if we do this sometime, we match up Galatians and James, and I show you these guys are not friends, nor with Peter, nor with the rest of the Ebionites. Paul steps out. I mentioned earlier that in Paul's letters, you'll not find a Hebrew name in there. If you can, it's one I've overlooked. I mean, in the main portions. Look at Romans 16. There's not a Hebrew name in there but Mary, but that's also a Greek name. Not a Roman name or not a Hebrew name in Philippians or Corinthians or where he greets people. And the people he greets, we have to look at because we know who they are. Not only that, but what does Paul write in? He doesn't write in Aramaic or Hebrew. Who would read Aramaic in Achaia, in Greece, or in Corinth, or in Tarsus? They didn't speak Aramaic there. They spoke Greek all over the world at this time. People say, oh, Paul wrote originally in Aramaic and had him translated. That's nonsense. Why would he have to have anything translated? He speaks Greek better than anybody we've ever seen in the world. Take a look at his letters. They're genius. I wish you could read them in the Greek. You'd see science there. Instead of some of these old King James words, you would see modern science in there, especially in Ephesians. He has impeccable Greek because he was raised in Tarsus, a city in Anatolia that is Greek. He went to school in Greek. He says he was a Pharisee of Pharisees, but he only quotes Greeks. Paul didn't write in Greek. What else about Paul? I have a couple of nice podcasts on Paul. One's called Paul the Socializer. The other's called What's Good About Paul? Lots of good about Paul. If we didn't have good about Paul, I would have nothing to teach on this pneumatology course that's coming up this weekend. I got to have Paul. But Paul was not in fellowship with the rest of these disciples. He denigrates them. He talks about the brothers of the Lord. Now, they can have women, but I can't. Why can't Barnabas and I have women? He says, oh, those super apostles, they think they're something, but they're really nothing. All through, he denigrates these guys because he's going somewhere else. And in Galatians, he abrogates the Torah. He says, Mount Sinai or the Torah is Mount Hagar. Not going to do this anymore. And that's all right, because if he goes to Europe, he can't do Torah. It's against the law. Circumcision is against the law. The Lex Cornelia law there, that you can't mutilate somebody's Gentiles. That's why he uses the word, let them mutilate themselves. That's what Roman law called it. And some of the later Paul material, Timothy and so forth, Paul didn't write that anyway, because he says no women can talk. Look at Romans, Corinthians. They got deaconesses, apostles that are women. Women teach all the time. Women have their own churches. But no, not in Timothy. They can't even talk. We have to reevaluate Paul using some outside material. So as far as the timeline, I've never done a timeline, but it shouldn't be too hard when you consider the Acts of the Apostles and the Nazarene Acts both follow the same source. We just learned that last week. They follow the same source. We don't have that source. We don't know what it is. All right. Before his conversion, the idea in Naz Acts that there was no conversion. Paul, his name in the first place was Saulus Paulus. Saulos, S-A-U-L-O-S, Paulos. Acts chapter 13 will tell you that. First, there's a mix-up of names there. There's Sergius Paulus, and there's Bar Jesus, and then there's Paulus, and there's Barnabas. More transfiguration of names, and then it says Saul, who is also called Paul, or vice versa. That's a surname, Saulus Paulus. I wouldn't want to be called Saul in Hebrew, because the Hebrew letters for Saul spell exactly the same thing as Sheol. You wouldn't want himself going around and people calling him hell all the time. Same letters. Saul and Sheol. But Saul in itself means a big guy, and Paul means a little guy. Paul is not a Greek name. We don't know where it came from. Some people say it came from Apollonia. What was his name? Apollonius of Tirana made it up, but I don't know. let's see. Yes, this is hard to do commentary on, believe me. But James, James, the brother of Jesus, if you know your sources, that's why I give Golam a blessing today, an email that came back to me for buying this book for me. And if you can't buy one, I'll send you one, an ebook. It's the most important book you'll ever read. Hundreds of lives have been changed. I've sent out thousands of these books free of charge. The message has to get out here. Rita Hayworth. Tell me again what AC stands for. Paul, the big AC. Yeah, it's not something bad, is it? It's not like a AH or anything like that. Yes, there is some evidence in the little book of 1 John that they considered at that time Paul being the Antichrist. Again, that's on my podcasts. I give it for the sake of information, not because I want you to believe it or not. We need to know everything we can because eternity's at stake. And some of us have come to the conclusion that we've been led astray. I was a church pastor 25 years. There was a better way. I think that Luke and Paul were very closely related, maybe not by blood, but I think Luke is Epaphroditus. If you look at the history of Epaphroditus, where he ended up, when he ended up, and you consider that Josephus dedicated his life story to Epaphroditus, Paul's friend, then it becomes clear to me. Luke, there's no Luke. They put that name on there because of the great physician. They just tacked that on there. There's no such person as him. Somebody wrote that. And the only one qualified in the 90s that I know of would be Epaphroditus, a writer. Paul timeline. Oh, that's nice. Thank you for that link. Well, look, just take it as it is. If you just come in, you missed a lot from the other ones. Like I said, there's probably 6 others. And get this book if you want to get into this. What I'm doing will help you get through the New Testament Code and James, the brother of Jesus, if you desire to read either one. Or you can just do this, you'll get an idea. Another good thing to do, I'll tell you one more thing, is to go out on the internet and look up Robert Price's review of both James, the brother of Jesus, and the New Testament Code. Robert Price, an atheist, does a bang-up job of writing reviews on especially James, the brother of Jesus. Now, a final note. This has nothing to do with my faith. With the exception of, I am interested in the historical Jesus and apostles. And I am not going to get those guys through the church. No way. So we look at every piece of manuscript that pops up out of the ground because that's all we got. We got some archaeology too, like the Jesus family tomb at Talpiot, 1 and 2. Lots of clues there. But where are we going to get this? I want to know about the man that stood before Pilate. When Pilate says, what is truth? He gives no answer. Why? Because the man standing there was the truth. Pilate couldn't even see it. I just say this because some of you folks haven't been on here before or for a long time. And there you have it. And I thank you very much. I usually don't go this long, but I appreciate you coming. If you didn't, I had no reason to do this. We'll be back on Friday night. And I don't know if we're doing Melchizedek. We're on Melchizedek then, or we're doing some inner healing. I got to look at my schedule and see, but I'll put it up there on Facebook. And if you all want to notice, I'll be glad to send it to you once I get your right email address. Yah be with you all. And if I don't see you tomorrow, I'll see you in the new kingdom.